We left and talking about biodiversity and ecosystem function, and this came up again. It was on there earlier. And it's been a controversy over time. And we've talked about the idea of, in conservation, that species being like rivets on an airplane wing, that if you pop one of thousands of rivets, it may not matter much. But if you pop enough of them while you're flying along, and maybe it'll all fall apart for you. And that's not a good thing. And then we usually there's enough microbial diversity to almost every habitat that's been looked at. The genes have been there for most of the major biogeochemical fluxes, you know, all the sulfur cycle, all the nitrogen cycle, all those things. There's a few groundwater ones that are very simple and maybe don't have all those. That said, complex groups of microbes, diverse groups of microbes can break materials down more readily than those that are fairly simple, even if they more quickly. So function still, rate still ties to, and function still ties to diversity. And then we also talked about the example of islands and shrimps in Puerto Rico, where if both species of shrimp, the shredder and the collector are there, they basically process the materials more quickly than if only one of them is there. And then another big place where biodiversity and ecosystem function is important in movement of nutrient flux across sediment water interface are other ways that they wouldn't move otherwise. And this is particularly true with what are called ecosystem engineers, that there are some organisms that really alter the entire system. And there's a number of these that we can think about, like beavers. They create dams and that retain materials in the watershed much longer than they would be otherwise, leading to, you know, sediment and then riparian plants and a whole ecosystem that may not exist there necessarily if those animals are not there. We talked about the hippopotamus and how Pablo Escobar brought them into South America, and the idea that, well, maybe, you know, them grazing and bringing stuff in. And then some other examples include salmon that go out into the ocean and then come back and reproduce in the streams and die and release all their nutrients. There have been studies of using stable isotopes because when the salmon feed in the ocean, they get a different nitrogen 15 signature in their bodies than they would have got had they just been grown up in the lakes or rivers right there. So you can see how much of the nutrient coming into the system is actually marine derived nutrients. And in doing so, they fertilize the riparian zone, and they've been able to find it in, it comes up out of the stream basically by things like emerging insects or bears going in and eating the salmon carcasses and then defecating or urinating in the forest nearby. Yes, a bear does defecate in the woods. That's a question that sometimes people ask. So they're also they also might be considered an ecosystem engineer. And in areas where they've been introduced, such as New Zealand, their streams were naturally had galaxid populations, which are different fish species, which they've driven out, and were macrophyte dominated, a lot of them. But when the salmon come in, they make their redds to put their eggs in, they stir everything up. And so they've really changed the nature of the streams to more gravel-based bottoms as opposed to macrophyte covered. So there's a number of examples of these. A lot of times these are related to nutrient movements that wouldn't happen because of molecular diffusion or flux, the normal flux, the way things go. So this is just an example of some macroinvertebrates that live in sediments, and how each of these invertebrates do different things. The sediments are anoxic, right? So they're not going to be able to, they're not going to be able to live in here unless they get some kind of oxygen. So we have a midge larvae here that's actually pumping materials through the sediment, and we have some oligochaetes that are sticking up here, maybe tubifex. There's some bivalves here that also pump materials through across their gills and excrete. But they basically all tend to move nutrients across this benthic sediment interface, which is limited by molecular diffusion, not transport diffusion, unless something's making transport diffusion happen across that. And then in the temperate areas, we have crayfish. Tropical areas, and there's an amphipod. In tropical areas, we might have other shrimps or crabs or crustaceans that do similar things. We've also talked about the loss of frog tadpoles in Panama related to the disease, and part of that changes the ecosystem function because they're not processing the leaves or grazing on the surfaces of the land, of the rocks. So now we're going to go through particulars of each ecosystem, each general type of ecosystem, or viewing the different types of ecosystem habitats as ecosystems. And the first of these is groundwater ecosystems, and we'll go through streams and wetlands and lakes. Groundwater ecosystems generally rely on organic material washed in from the surface. So that would be allochthonous materials. Although some of them are based on primary production in the system. So when we talked about the sulfur cycle, we talked about the caves in Romania, where the sulfide comes out and meets the oxygen in the cave, and then the bacteria that oxidize the sulfide are able to fix our carbon and be autotrophic there. Many systems are ultra oligotrophic, and the extreme example of this is one groundwater system where they dated the carbon and used radio dating and found the carbon being over 10,000 years old, and figured out how quickly it's coming into the system, how it washed in a long time ago, but there's still an active microbial biomass down there, and those microbes were probably dividing on the order of thousands of years, every thousands of years. So it's extraordinarily oligotrophic and nutrient poor. And so permeability and water flow are really important. When large channels exist, then animals can be important in groundwater. And what types of, do you remember what type of habitat that's the most common in? What the geological setting is that leads to groundwater with large permeability? Sandy, yes. Not really big animals. You could definitely get some small ones, and yeah, definitely got it karst, right. Limestone. The big channels can even caves can be created there, and this is where we see the really spectacular examples of many of the really spectacular examples of animals, blind and pigmented and that kind of thing. There's also some really interesting ones in some of the glacial valleys that have been found in Montana, where there's large cobble that was left behind the glaciers, and there's stoneflies that have their entire life cycle down below in the groundwater there. And so this is a plot of the relative rates of respiration in ecosystems. And on the y-axis is carbon dioxide production in moles per liter per year on the y-axis. And we see there's a logarithmic scale, right? So, it's, what is this? 15 orders of magnitude, right? A huge range of different ones. And sewage sludge is really cranking along, right? That's sort of at the top level. That's what we're doing when we make active sludge and we are treating for biochemical oxygen demand. We're putting oxygen in there. We're trying to stimulate the rate of respiration as high as possible to blow that off as carbon dioxide. Soils and lake sediments are fairly similar. They're pretty active. And certainly relative to subsurface aquifers, which then we're talking about thousands of times more lower CO2 respiration rates. And then really deep aquifers, well, there's still microbial life there, and you can detect a very slow rate of activity. Again, 10 to the 12th times less active than sewage. So there's, some, now this is not always true. I mean, if you dump sewage into groundwater, for example, you'd have the higher rates, right? But at least somewhat higher rates. We'll leave that and we'll move to streams. And I'm going to talk about several major concepts: the flood pulse concept, and autochthonous versus allochthonous production, nutrient spiraling, and river continuum. And autochthonous means produced inside the system, and allochthonous means outside the system, to review. Start with the flood pulse concept, and we've covered this a little bit, the idea of traditionally that floods were disturbances, but that there's a natural flow regime that organisms have adapted to, and they're maybe not necessarily all bad. And they're certainly not all bad for all organisms. So that's the more recent realization that flooding is an integral part of ecosystems. And one of the things it does is it moves materials to and from the riparian flood zone, and that can be really important. And it increases connectivity between the oxbows and wetlands and riparian areas in the river, and resets communities. So if you're an early succession species, that may be good for you, right? And it can encourage reproduction of some species. So some examples. In 1993, we had massive floods in the Midwest. In a few years, they were not quite as big, but that was repeated. But many of the Missouri River fishes started spawning like crazy because that's the time when historically, when the water came up and it got this, the pools on the sides enriched, right? That's when it'd be the best time for them to lay their eggs and for their larvae to be successful. And that's something that's been missing from the system, the really big floods and the connectivity of the floodplain to the main channel. And we've also talked about the fishes in the forest in Amazon and how they eat fruits, but also, and that's part of the flood pulse, but also there's oxbows and lakes and wetlands that border the Amazon River. And each year those floods will replenish nutrients in the lakes and the riparian. And when we talk about wetlands, we'll talk about the Pantanal, and this is a similar situation. And then we've also mentioned ancient Egypt, where productivity of crops in the riparian zone was driven by annual nutrient input from floods. So these are things that can be helpful to the people that live near the systems as well, that have learned to adapt to coexisting with that particular system. And this then is going all the way back to the stream chapter. And remember, we have the meanders and the oxbows and all that. And this graph, the drawing below then is actually a schematic of what was really happening in a particular river, tropical river system. And we see that we have these oxbows starting to pinch off in the main flow, but a little braided flow, and then different marshes, maybe a scoop out that was an old oxbow. It's always wet. But if you have flooding coming in over the top, it's going to put a bunch of nutrient in there and fire that system up. And we've got some little permanent ponds in here that are related to different oxbows over time as that's developed, as this has moved and left that behind. So you can see how the floods could be important locally. What we talked about in the Missouri River is this has all been taken away for the most part, and there's levees up close, right? So all that difference has been taken away, and then the dams upstream have artificially changed the flow regime such that there's ample flow for moving barge traffic during about 3/4 of the year, centering around the summer time, and then it just drops down in the winter time. The next idea is related to nutrient cycling, and this is a different concept about how nutrients are moved through systems, and this is called the concept of nutrient spiraling. So the main index of this spiraling length is made of it's the average distance that each nutrient, that half the nutrient travels, right, before it's recycled. And so it can be broken into two components, the water part and the particulate part. And specifically, this is like, we can think of some nutrient dissolved in the water, and then it's taken up by the periphyton on the bottom, maybe eaten by an insect, and then excreted out and then back into the water, right? So there's these two phases associated with the benthic zone or particulate material, and then flowing, dissolved in the water. So the reason this has called spiraling is, if you remember the nutrient cycles that we drew, right, they're in circles, right? Everything's cycling in circle, but if you put a downward flow component to it, then the circle becomes a spiral. So that's the conceptual way to think about it. So a couple of questions of the day here. Should nutrient spirals, and let's just talk mostly about S sub W if you want, should they be longer in higher low velocity systems, and should they be longer for limiting or non-limiting nutrients? Great. So basically anything that stimulates nutrient uptake is going to make for shorter spiraling. That is, the system's going to be more retentive of the nutrients. And so spirals should be longer for non-limiting nutrients than limiting nutrients. Spirals will be longer if the velocity is high, because just on average, things are going to move further before they get taken up, right? It'll be over each area of the bottom for less time. If you have higher metabolic rates, you're going to have higher spiraling. So if you have a higher temperature, for example, and you can imagine things like floods that scour the bottom of the system. And those are going to basically make for very long spiraling lengths as the flood happens, right? Because it's higher velocity. But also, if they get rid of a lot of the biofilm, then the demand for nutrients goes down. So the spiraling length may stay long as well. So allochthonous versus autochthonous. In streams, it can be really important because if the light can get into the system, then there's going to be primary production. But forested areas shade the system out, then they dump a lot of organic carbon in the leaves if they are deciduous, particularly in temperate zones. The metabolic measurements suggest almost all streams are net heterotrophic. That is, there's more heterotrophic carbon use than is produced, but some just more so than others. And this then gets expanded out into one of the key concepts of stream ecology, and this is called the river continuum concept. And it's an interesting one because it puts rivers in their context of the watershed and upstream to downstream trends. We see on the left that we have stream orders going from 1st to 10th order. So we're going, to a large river here in the headwater stream. And it was originally conceived of in deciduous forested areas, perhaps going from higher elevation down into a lower elevation system. And as we go downstream, the channel width is going to get wider and wider. Makes sense. We have riparian zones, then lots of leaf input, right? So most input in the smallest streams is going to be based on leaves. They're shaded, so the primary production is not going to be very high. So primary production to respiration rates are very, very low. As we move downstream, the channel widens out, right? And so light can get into the system, and the primary producers, the periphyton, can really take off. So here we have a lot of fine particulate organic material. And then we have primary food sources. We see that the periphytons start coming up in availability. Finally, when we move downstream, we have a lot of fine particulate organic material and maybe even phytoplankton if it's moving slowly, so suspended algae, and perhaps some macrophytes in here too. This is going to be a function of how turbid the system is, right? So if we have a lot of cropland up in the watersheds up here and it's very turbid, what's going to happen to the chance for there being phytoplankton or maybe even periphyton? Anybody? So what does turbidity do to light? Like if you have a bunch of clay in the water, for example, what's going to happen to the light? There might be more productivity in warm temperatures. Can't get through as easily. Good. Yeah, there's less light, right? So if you have a really turbid system, you're not going to get algal blooms in it, right? And you're not going to get these phytoplankton growing. But if you don't have such a turbid system, then maybe it'd be a real clear river that slows down. You might be able to get some phytoplankton. Okay, and then each part of the system is essentially leaking out material. So you look at the biomass up in the upper areas, and there's a few grazers, but it's a lot of shredders and collectors, right? They're relying mainly on these leaves and this fine particulate organic material. And then there's some predators that might be eating those things. They're going to excrete, and that fine particulate material is going to be moved downstream. So there'll be more fine particulate material, it'll be increasing, and some leaves from the side, because there's still some leaves on the side. And then the periphyton start, right? So you can get the growth of the attached algae. So then we go from almost no grazers to increased number of grazers, fewer shredders. And these might be snails or mayflies or something like that. And the shredders might be, and the collectors, again, we've got a caddisfly larvae here and a dragonfly larvae there, inodinate there as well. And then finally, when we move downstream, we have almost all collectors, predators, and maybe some zooplankton as well. Okay, so we get a lot more like a lake as we move downstream, but also there's a lot of fine particulate material here. This could also include things like mussels and in any filter feeding collectors. So we're building, and then getting to the top of the food web. At the very smallest streams, we may not have any fishes at all, or just one or two species. But then we'd have some fairly small species that would be adapted to eating invertebrates mainly. But as we move downstream, we can get some piscivorous fishes, right? Because there's more fish biomass that can be supported and a lot more habitat. And finally, as we move down to the very bottom, we get species that are adapted to living perhaps in highly turbid systems in large rivers, such as these sturgeons that have the electrochemical sensors in their nose, their snout thing, that they can root out plankton or midges down the sediment or something like that. And catfish with their barbels and their electrical and chemical stimulate abilities to sense those parts of prey in lower light. You can see that these fishes why don't they have very big eyes, right? Like look, relative to a bass, a sturgeon has a tiny little eye. Anybody? Tiny eyes, sturgeons, why? I'll give you a hint, it's probably not much phytoplankton down there when that happens. They don't need them to see if they can sense the fish. Yes, that's right. And not only that, yeah, they use their nose to see with electrical fields. That's true. But what's the other thing? It could go back to why there's not much phytoplankton in some of those large rivers, right? What's missing at the bottom of the yeah, not much light. Good, Abigail. Yeah, so there's not much light there. So why would you, worry about putting a lot of energy into building eyes? Evolution leads to building other things that work in that habitat. So what's attractive about this this concept in a couple ways is that it's complex, but it builds. It builds from the primary production to respiration, the food that's coming in, what the type of food is that's coming into each place, what's transmitted downstream, how that translates to not only the ecosystem characteristics, but also the organisms, the invertebrates that you might find there, and then finally to the entire food web, the fishes. It's an interesting view because it also is a view, we'll talk about landscape ecology, and viewing the system as a whole, holistically, and linked systems is something that even now is viewed as sort of kind of at the front edge of ecology. But this idea was put out in the 80s, so it's one that's received a lot of attention over the years and has been quite useful. And this is a new figure that's not in your book because we wrote a chapter for the Encyclopedia of Freshwater Ecology Encyclopedia that is on this, me and myself and one of my colleagues. All right. So one of the criticisms, well, there have been a number of critiques of this, and one of those is that this biome that this is in, it's not all streams are in temperate zones, right? So they don't necessarily have deciduous trees that drop a bunch of leaves. Not all of them are, not, an Arctic stream might have not much, maybe some willows around the smallest streams, and not really any trees at all if it's in the tundra. So one example that we have taken from grassland streams of this from a publication quite a few years ago now is how you might think about this in terms of a stream that's intermittent in a grassland, and how you might take the same approach and fit it to match the biome that you're in. So as we move from upstream to downstream, you can think about a number of things that happen. Floods aren't very intense upstream. As you get lower and lower down the stream, the floods get more and more intense, just because you have more and more watershed and you just start moving a lot of rock and all kinds of stuff like that. So you get this, this intensity of flooding where you can have low diversity anyway because you're upstream, but then you get low diversity again at the bottom, right? And then the streams in this area are intermittent, so that the higher up you are in general, the higher the probability of drying. And that's also going to knock back diversity. We talked about harshness index earlier when we talked about complex community interactions. In addition, you don't have much tree cover in a grassland, so you're going to have a lot of light here. You're going to have a lot more periphyton, a lot production, a lot more autochthonous material and less allotthonous material than in a forested area. As you move downstream and the canopy gets thicker with shrubs, then you're going to get more leaf material, and the primary production is going to be less important than respiration. And then you can imagine if you don't have grass, if you don't have trees, you're not going to have so many shredders, right? But if you have more production, we're going to have grazers. So you're going to have this shift in the expected community composition. And then as it opens up and you get more leaves, you can have grazers and shredders. And you move downstream, and that again, the shredders take over and the grazers don't do so well. And then this system, also the movement of materials is important. There's these refugia, there's springs where organisms can live in spring-fed pools, and they can drift downstream and recolonize when it dries. But also organisms can, aquatic insects can have adults that can fly upstream or can fly from one side channel to another. So this is just an example of taking a basic concept and making it match. And you can imagine doing this for an Arctic stream, for a tropical stream, for a desert stream, any of those. Okay, so we've gone through some of the major concepts in stream ecology, and now we're going to move into lakes and reservoirs. And really, the classic view of lakes was based on the pelagic of a lake and it being sort of a sealed off thing in and of itself. And that's really started to expand a lot more partially because most lakes are small. Also, they're part of a watershed. And if that happens, if the lakes are small, then they're going to have more littoral zones, going to be a more important part of the ecosystem. So it's not just going to be phytoplankton, zooplanktivorous fish, big fish, right? There's going to be macrophytes, and there's going to be periphyton, and there's going to be snails eating the periphyton, and the fish can go off into the side, so it becomes a lot more complex. And then the focus was always on primary production by phytoplankton, or often by phytoplankton in the lake. But John Cole and co-workers went to literature on CO2 concentrations in lakes throughout the world. And they looked at concentrations in thousands and thousands of lakes. And they show that carbon dioxide is super saturating in most lakes. What that means is that there has to be more heterotrophic respiration than there is primary production, right? Because photosynthesis is taking CO2 out, respiration is putting it in. So if there's more coming in than it's being taken out, right, then you get supersaturated CO2, and it's going to be trying to equilibrate with the atmosphere. This is actually controversial and led to one of the few times that I've been in a scientific meeting where I've seen a shouting match break out after a talk when he gave this talk. And the moderator actually had to tell him to take it out to the hall because the next talk had to start. So that was, controversial, but what it's meant in the long run is that all the stuff that's washing in from upstream, just like in the streams we talked about, the materials that coming in from above are important for the systems. The materials coming in from above into the lakes are important, and way more important than people thought. This means that the microbial loop is more important than people thought as well. So we go back to the microbial loop. Remember, there's the bacteria that are eating up that organic material, and the protozoa that are eating them, and the zooplankton that are eating the protozoa, and they're cycling all that stuff around, right? That is driven in large part by the organic material coming in from outside the system, not the stuff that was produced in the system. And that's part of that graph or image that I put up in the microbial loop that I kind of left out conveniently. I didn't put how do you deal with the organic material coming in from outside. So this is something that, since I was taking this class 40 years ago, the view has really kind of evolved and changed since then. So this is the classic view of the lake, right? Where there's some nutrient coming in from outside, but it's driven in large part by what also CO2 is coming in. And we have the phytoplankton, the zooplankton, the fish. And then here, the detritus and dissolved nutrients and bacteria. The microbial loop is down here. You get deposition of nutrients into the benthic zone, organic carbon, and then also coming back out again. Then we get methane, nitrous oxide, maybe hydrogen sulfide coming out of the sediments. So what are those processes that would be producing those? Yeah, so that's good. So the benthic zone, it has anoxia in it, right? And you can get methanogenesis, maybe hydrogen sulfide production, nitrous oxide. First there'll be hydrogen sulfide production, then methanogenesis. But there might be a layer of bacteria here that's catching it all, right? There might be methyltrophs that catch it before it comes out. There might be sulfur oxidizing bacteria as well. But this is kind of an idea of how you can view the lake as an ecosystem and put the nutrient cycles that we talked about way back when in context with the food web that we've been talking about since then, and trying to integrate all that together. So we can think of some of the generalized characteristics that you might see in different types of lakes. If we think of oligotrophic, mesotrophic, and eutrophic lakes, the lakes are getting much more productive as you go along this gradient, right? You're not going to have an anoxic hypolimnia in an oligotrophic lake. We talked about that being important in terms of reversing eutrophication, right? If you push it up to this point, it's hard to come back because the phosphorus keeps getting recycled, right? And this is related to the hypolimnetic oxygen depletion rate. So the more production there is, the more stuff falls into the hypolimnion. And if enough stuff falls in there and the microbes are active, they can use up all the oxygen and lead to anoxic hypolimnion. And so this really depends, you know, this really sort of is setting the idea of trophic state. It can be set by how quickly oxygen disappears in the summer after stratification goes up. And then we tend to have nitrogen and phosphorus limiting in oligotrophic lakes, maybe grazing. So the trophic cascade appears to be the most important in mesotrophic lakes. When you get into super eutrophic lakes with cyanobacteria blooms, oxygen going down, fish kicking off, they just can't graze fast enough. And like get N limitation, nitrogen fixation, high rates of denitrification because you have anoxia, low rates of, and high rates of nitrogen fixation in these lakes. All right, so we can put it all together. And that's what we're trying to do in these chapters.